All right, fundamentals of nervous system and nervous tissue, part 2. So moving on to neuroglia. Neuroglia are the other cells found in the nervous tissue. There are lots of neuroglia cells, actually more neuroglia cells than there are neurons, and they have a variety of functions. We will start off with the 4 neuroglial cells found in the central nervous system. These include the astrocytes, the oligodendrocytes, the microglial cells, and the epidermal cells. The astrocytes are very important. The astrocytes make physical contact with the neurons themselves. They make contact with the pia mater, which is a sheet of connective tissue on the surface of the brain, and with blood vessels. When the astrocytes form contacts with the blood vessels, the blood capillaries, they surround the blood capillaries, forming what's called the blood-brain barrier. Blood-brain barrier is very important in controlling what can and cannot get into the nervous tissue in the brain and spinal cord. The astrocytes, because of this blood-brain barrier, help to maintain the appropriate chemical environment for the nervous tissue. So they restrict what can come in so that only the appropriate electrolytes and water and other chemicals make it into the nervous tissue. It is thought they have a role in learning and memory by guiding the formation of synapses, though that is not fully understood. And if there is some sort of damage to the central nervous system, they will divide and fill in those damaged areas, forming non-functional space that's just being structurally important, kind of like a scar. The oligodendrocytes are another nucleus cells. Their job is to form myelin sheaths, to form insulating coatings around portions of the axons of the neurons. So here's an oligodendrocyte. It looks kind of like an octopus. It sends out its tentacles, and it forms little sections of myelination, little myelin sheath regions on different axons and different portions of axons. And the myelin sheath is very important because it helps to increase the speed of the nerve impulse. It gets it to the end of the axon much faster. Microglia cells are little bitty cells that travel through the central nervous system, and their function is to act as phagocytes. They engulf things and destroy it, such as pathogens, bacteria and viruses. They will destroy any cellular debris that may have formed, and they get rid of damaged nervous tissue that is no longer functioning. So they go around, find these targets, surround them, pull them in through endocytosis, and destroy them. The epidermal cells are epithelial cells that form sheets. These epidermal sheets have little processes coming off of them, such as microvilli and or cilia, and they are lining the ventricles of the brain. These are spaces within the brain, and they produce what's called cerebrospinal fluid. So if they produce cerebrospinal fluid, it goes into the ventricles of the brain, and then they make sure the cerebrospinal fluid is the proper composition chemically, and also they help to circulate the fluid by the cilia. The cilia will wave, will move, generating current in the cerebrospinal fluid, allowing it to travel through the brain, around the spinal cord. There are also 2 neuroglia cells of the peripheral nervous system, the Schwann cells and the satellite cells. The Schwann cells do the same thing as the oligodendrocytes. They form myelin sheaths around sections of axons of neurons. However, the Schwann cells only form a single unit of the myelin sheath. They just do one spot and that is it. The satellite cells, their job is to surround and protect cell bodies of neurons found in the peripheral nervous system. So neural cell bodies will group together. The satellite cells will surround and protect them. And this forms that structure called a ganglion. Again, a ganglion, a group of neural cell bodies found in the peripheral nervous system. Myelination is very important. The way it works is the Schwann cell or the oligodendrocyte will wrap its plasma membrane around that part of the axon again and again and again. So it's very, very thick. This forms an insulation that actually speeds the nerve impulse along its way. Most axons are myelinated, but not all. It also turns out that myelination is white in color, so that if you have a lot of axons, then that tissue will look whitish in color. You also notice that the myelin sheath does not cover the entire axon. There are little spaces. These spaces are critical, and they are referred to as myelin sheath gaps. So the myelin sheath gaps are spaces where there is no myelination. Turns out the nerve impulse will come down and basically jump from gap to gap, traveling down the length of the axon. As I mentioned before, there are unmyelinated axons out there. Not a lot, but they are there. They do associate with Schwann cells. However, it doesn't form a myelin sheath around them. It just holds the axons together, thereby structurally keeping them together. So it's just a structural formation. Gray matter and white matter. White matter is when you see tissue, nervous tissue that is light in color, and that means there's lots and lots of myelinated axons there. Lots of myelinated axons. So these act as wires transmitting information from point A to point B. Gray matter of nervous tissue in the primarily central nervous system is where you'll find lots and lots of neural cell bodies. Near neural cell bodies are dendrites, so this is where there will be a lot of synapsing occurring. Synapsing is thought to be what is the processing of information. So that would be the hard drive of the system where information is being processed. And the reason why it's gray is because lots of cell bodies means you have lots of chromatophilic substance, which is gray. So some vocabulary. Nucleus. A nucleus is a collection of neural cell bodies in the central nervous system. So lots of neural cell bodies together in the central nervous system. A tract is a lot of nerve fibers. These are the axons that are all together in the central nervous system. For the peripheral nervous system, the ganglion is the collection of neural cell bodies. And the nerve, that is the official name for nerve fibers, the axons, all grouped together. In the case of the peripheral nervous system, it's a very well-defined structure. The structure is arranged in a manner that might seem familiar. So here is a nerve. The nerve is surrounded completely by a sheet of connective tissue called the epineurium. Within the nerve are bundles of nerve fibers in structures called fascicles. So you have multiple fascicles with making up the nerve, surrounded by a sheet of epineurium around the entire nerve. Also found in the nerve are blood vessels. Now each fascicle is surrounded by a sheet of connective tissue called a perineurium. So every fascicle surrounded by a perineurium, all the fascicles bundled together, surrounded by the epineurium. Within the fascicle are the nerve fibers. A nerve fiber is an axon and its myelin sheath. The axon and its myelin sheath. And each nerve fiber is surrounded by a sheet of connective tissue called an endoneurium. So endoneurium surrounds the nerve fiber, perineurium surrounds the fascicle, epineurium surrounds the entire nerve. And this should seem familiar because it's sort of how skeletal muscles were arranged. All right, the reflex arc. Well, reflexes are fast responses our body does that does not involve the brain. The responses that occur without the brain. So you have a receptor, say in the skin, detecting poking yourself with a needle. The receptor detects the stimulus. The receptor may be the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron then carries the signal, the information, to the central nervous system. There it may or may not interact with an interneuron. Interneurons are found in the central nervous system, so all neurons solely in the central nervous system are interneurons. That will integrate the information and then send a command to a motor neuron to send out the motor response to the relevant effector, in this case a skeletal muscle, to move away from the source of the pain. So you have a receptor, detects the stimulus, sensory neuron carries the information to the central nervous system, potential integrative center, interneuron, and then a motor neuron sending the command to the effector. In this case, all in the spinal cord, so the brain is not involved. So for instance, when the doctor hits the ligament on your knee and causes you to kick, that is a patellar reflex, a monosynaptic stretch reflex, because the stretch of the ligament causes the stretch in the muscle that is detected by a receptor, a stretch receptor. That then sends the information via the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. Sensory neuron will then synapse with a motor neuron, sends out the command to cause muscles to contract so that you kick, the effector being the muscles contracting. So no interneuron involved. That's why it's monosynaptic. Receptor sends information to the sensory neuron, synapses with the motor neuron that causes the effector, the skeletal muscle, to cause the kick. The polysynaptic withdrawal reflex is when you touch something that hurts you, whether it's hot or pointy or whatever. You have your receptor, the sensory receptor, which in this case is the sensory neuron. Sensory neuron carries the information of the pain to the spinal cord. It then synapses with an interneuron, which then synapses with a motor neuron that sends the command to the relevant skeletal muscles, the effectors. So you pull away from the thing that hurts you. Again, the sensory receptor, in this case, is the sensory neuron carrying the information to the spinal cord. Synapses with an interneuron, synapses with a motor neuron that sends the command to the effectors so that you pull away from the pain. Again, the brain is not involved. It's made aware of what's happening. You know what's happened, but the brain is not involved with that withdrawal reflex. All right, so we're having information going up to the brain. So that means information from the sensory neuron gets sent by that interneuron, in the case of touching something hot, into a set of axons that are going to carry the information via those nerve fibers up to the brain. This is referred to as an ascending interneuron. The information is going up, ascending up to the brain. So there are tracks within the spinal cord that are ascending tracks carrying information up to the brain. When it reaches the brain, it will synapse and further send the sensory information to the gray matter so that information can be processed. Again, the integrative function of the brain. And then a decision, a response will be decided upon, and commands will be sent via motor neurons down the spinal cord through descending interneurons, carrying the information down to the relevant part of the spinal cord. So these would be descending tracks in the spinal cord, sending the commands down. It will then synapse with a motor neuron that will then say control muscles, effectors, having you go and cool that injury down in some water. Take care of your boo-boo. So again, you have sensory information going up, ascending tracks to the brain where it's processed, and then commands going down, descending tracks to eventually get to the motor neurons so that you can respond. Multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is a progressive degenerative disorder found in the brain. What is happening is the myelination, the oligodendrocytes that are myelinated, the axons, are being destroyed. You can actually see lesions in the brain where this is occurring. And this causes the transmission of nerve impulses within the brain and spinal cord to slow down, to not be at the speed they need so that the body works properly. Possible symptoms of multiple sclerosis include numbness in areas of the body or maybe pain in the skin as neurotransmissions are getting screwed up because they're not going fast enough. Vision problems, again, the visual information not arriving fast enough to relate what you see in the real world to what your brain's able to process. Muscle weakness because you're having trouble controlling, sending those motor commands out. Muscle paralysis, slurred speech, fatigue. So a very serious progressive disorder, all involving the breakdown, the destruction of myelination in the nervous system, destruction of the oligodendrocytes. Hope you enjoyed this second part of this lecture.